How does someone who avoided headlines and fame build and sustain a gambling system that linked bettors, bookmakers, and wire networks across the country? Background and context. Frank Erickson operated in the United States during the first half of the 20th century. He rose from small-time bookmaking into a position of national influence across the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Erickson is best known as a principal bookmaker and a behind-the-scenes organizer who worked alongside well-known figures in organized gambling. He became a central figure in the development of coordinated betting systems and wire services that allowed race information and odds to flow between cities. The era matters. This was a period when gambling moved from fragmented local books into large interstate enterprises. Telephone and telegraph technology made national coordination possible. Federal law and state law were uneven, and enforcement resources were limited and scattered. That environment rewarded people who could connect capital, information, and trusted intermediaries across jurisdictions. Erickson was one of those connectors. The crime, stated plainly, Erickson's activities centered on illegal bookmaking and on operating or coordinating the systems that supported it. This included running layoff operations, moving bets between books, and participating in the wire services that distributed racing results and odds. He kept a low personal profile while controlling flows of money and information. At various points, he was convicted on gambling and tax charges. These are the factual points that anchor the case. The investigation step by step. 1. Early inquiries and local enforcement. Local police and district attorneys first focused on visible gambling dens and street-level bookies. Those actions were useful against small operators, but they did not reach the organized layer that coordinated multiple books across state lines. Erickson's operation relied on intermediaries and leased information lines, which insulated him from many routine raids. Early enforcement, therefore, produced arrests, but not the systemic breakup of the network. 2. Federal attention and committee hearings. As interstate networks expanded, federal authorities and congressional investigators began to see the problem as a national one. Committees such as the Kefauver investigations in the late 1940s and early 1950s highlighted how wire services and coordinated bookmaking crossed state boundaries. Those hearings exposed structural vulnerabilities and pushed for stronger federal tools. They also publicly identified several key figures and practices, which increased pressure on operators. 3. Law enforcement tactics that worked. What worked for authorities in this era was shifting the focus away from street-level gambling to the money in the accounts. Investigators used financial records, informant testimony, and the new appetite for federal prosecution of interstate gambling. Targeting the economic base, bookkeeping, ledgers, bank transfers, and leases for wire lines made it possible to build cases that state-level misdemeanor charges could not. When paperwork and ledgers appeared, convictions followed. 4. Mistakes and gaps in the investigation. Investigators faced limits. The main mistakes were tactical and structural. Agencies treated gambling as a moral or local problem for too long. That allowed national coordination to solidify. In some cases, investigators pursued high-profile testimony or relied on witnesses who later recanted. Another persistent weakness was jurisdictional fragmentation. Different states had different priorities and resources, and that mismatch allowed operators to reroute activity to weaker areas. Finally, law enforcement sometimes failed to move quickly enough on financial leads, allowing assets to be concealed or dissipated. 5. What failed and why? Efforts that aimed solely at visible enforcement failed to stop the system. Raids closed shops temporarily, but they did not sever the information or funds pipelines. Without coordinated federal action focused on money flows and the communication infrastructure, operators simply adapted. The criminal structure's resilience exposed the need for modern investigative strategies that prioritized finance and interagency cooperation. Operational analysis. Erickson as an operator. How he operated. Erickson was a connector. He did not seek headlines. Instead, he built and supervised networks. He managed layoff betting, moving bets between books to balance exposure. He invested in or advocated for shared wire services that transmitted race information and odds to remote bookies. That technical and logistical control gave his network scale and allowed smaller operators to function without owning the infrastructure themselves. His influence came from controlling the plumbing of the business rather than from visible acts of violence. What exposed him? Two broad vulnerabilities exposed Erickson's operations. First, the growth of written records associated with professionalization created documentary trails. Moving from informal cash handling to organized offices with accountants left evidence. Second, congressional and federal pressure shifted enforcement priorities to interstate crimes and financial irregularities. Once investigators had legal avenues to follow money and communications, the organizational cover that had protected operators began to erode. Public hearings and press attention also increased the risk that associates would cooperate. Why his control eventually failed. Erickson's approach depended on centralized information flows and trusted intermediaries. When law enforcement developed tools to intercept or subpoena those flows, the network became brittle. Additionally, the system matured into a larger commercial enterprise. Greater scale meant more visibility. The very steps that built reliability, record-keeping, leased lines, and hired accountants, also built evidence that could be used in prosecution. Finally, legal pressures on tax and financial compliance removed the safe spaces that had sheltered bookmaking profits. Legal outcome. Erickson faced prosecutions tied to gambling and to taxes. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, he was convicted on illegal gambling charges and later on tax-related counts. Sentencing and enforcement removed him from the central operational role he had maintained for decades. By the time of his death in 1968, his influence had declined from its mid-century peak. The public record shows convictions and penalties that illustrate the shift from informal enforcement to legal strategies that targeted the finances underpinning organized gambling. Lessons from the Erickson case. 1. Criminal power is often administrative and informational. The case shows that control may flow from logistics rather than violence. Understanding networks means tracing communications and accounting. 2. Professionalization creates evidence. When illegal operations scale up and adopt formal systems, offices, ledgers, leased lines, they generate the records investigators need. That dynamic turns operational success into forensic vulnerability. 3. Jurisdictional coordination matters. Fragmented enforcement enables adaptation. A national criminal network will exploit gaps between local, state, and federal responses. Effective policing requires legal tools that match the geography of the crime. 4. Financial investigation is a force multiplier. Targeting money and tax compliance proved decisive. The Erickson era helped demonstrate that financial and communication trails are often the most reliable levers for dismantling organized systems. 5. Low profile does not mean low impact. Operators who avoid spectacle can be harder to detect, yet more dangerous to systems. Policy and enforcement should account for influence that is primarily structural, not theatrical. Why the case still matters. Modern illegal markets still depend on connectors, people who design payment channels, manage information flows, and supply technical infrastructure. The lessons from Erickson's era are relevant today. Law enforcement must keep adapting to new communication tools, new payment systems, and new legal jurisdictions. The historical shift from raids to financial investigation remains a model for responding to organized economic crime at scale. Conclusion. Frank Erickson's story is not a tale of celebrity or violent leadership. It is a study in operational power. He shows how organization, information, and finance can produce durable criminal capacity. The response that eventually limited his influence came not from spectacle, but from institutional change. Federal attention, financial scrutiny, and legal tools that matched the crime's geography. Understanding his role helps shift focus in modern policing away from personalities and towards systems. That perspective makes policy and enforcement more precise, and it narrows the space in which low-profile but powerful operators can hide.
Gentlemen, we have a critical decision to make. The stakes are higher than ever.